Story 1. I used to deliver for Pizza Hut in my old life. I had to navigate the entire city with a map book while the clock was ticking and the pizza was cooling. I could find any house in town in under 10 minutes. Now I can barely get to the grocery store without Google Maps. Story 2. I was a master at printing black and white and color in the darkroom. Story 3. Teaching people how to manually set up an email account in Outlook using Post Office Protocol version 3 settings and simple mail transfer protocol. Story 4. I was like an expert shooter with my laser gun personal digital assistant when I worked at Target. Story 5. Programming in common business-oriented language, formula translation, beginner's all-purpose symbolic instruction code, report program generator 3. I know how to use a fire hose to water artificial turf so that field hockey balls do not bounce too much. Story 6. The ability to identify opaque pigment ink colors. I was a receptionist at a nail salon in high school before gel polish became popular. Many women would show me their hand and say, "I got this last time. Do you know which one it is?" I did because I saw the same colors every day. Story 7. Teaching older coworkers how to fix a printer paper jam. After the first dozen times, you realize they just cannot be bothered to learn. Story 8. It is very specific to translate military discharge forms and old service records and convert them into current, workable skills and information for resumes and curriculum vitae. When I started in the professional resume writing field around 2015, about 60 to 70% of my clients were post-retirement age service members looking to rejoin the workforce. Whether they were career military personnel or those discharged after a few years who then entered a single career for the next 30 or more years, they always insisted that we include every single detail. For example, rebuilding aircraft engines in the 1970s will not be relevant to an entry-level customer service job 40 years later. If I never have to see another Department of Defense Form 214, it will still be too soon. Story 9. Typing. People used to be paid just to type. Now everyone knows how to type. Story 10. I used to maintain a group of carbon dioxide laser cutting tables outputting from 3 to 6 kilowatts in beam energy. I kept the beam alignment set and fine-tuned the radio frequency bus and gas mixture to maximize efficiency. Everything is going solid state these days, with the beam traveling through fiber optics instead of bouncing off mirrors through an atmosphere of nitrogen. There is not much for me to do when it comes to beam generation. It is, without a doubt, much more reliable and requires much less work, but I still miss the old ones. They required a lot of upkeep, but they felt alive. Using radio waves blasted towards a centrifuge full of precisely mixed gases to create a beam of light that can cut through inch-thick steel like nothing else. Magic. Story 11. Printing a PowerPoint presentation on overhead transparencies. Story 12. Ever try to knock all the ice and snow off a chairlift chair as it goes by with a push broom? 120 times in a row if you are skilled and can clear the whole chair in one pass, 240 times in a row if not. This is done in the cold and dark at 6 a.m., halfway up a frozen mountain in the middle of winter. I will never need to use the skill again, maybe in retirement, but if you work as a lift operator and receive unexpected gifts from strangers riding your chair, that is why. Story 13. I am really good at closing egg cartons quickly. I used to work at an egg farm where I was usually assigned to the line with an older machine that had a broken carton closer. I had to close every carton by hand before packing them into the crate. I can do it one-handed with my eyes closed. Story 14. Fresh out of university, I had a difficult boss who would send me to interact with very senior colleagues on her behalf, deliberately slighting them. I don't know how much of it was in her head because she was unstable, but she would send me to talk to directors and executive-level staff despite my lack of knowledge, which was kind of the point. People said, "Oh, but you learn how to think fast." No, it was a completely useless skill. I didn't learn anything from that experience other than to be an unwilling participant in office politics. Story 15. Making large batches of tapioca pearls in a stock pot and adjusting the time and temperature to achieve the correct consistency. I cannot stand tapioca pearls anymore and will never make them again. Years of making batch after batch and then taste testing them repeatedly. Blech. Story 16. Hand weighing items, used to work at a butcher's shop. Almost completely lost the memorized weights though. Story 17. Remembering the codes for different fruits and vegetables so that the checkout system would identify the item before weighing. Story 18. Setting up an embroidery machine, usually 8 heads with 15 needles per head. Running a $40,000 Roland banner printer at the time. Story 19. Excel spreadsheets improved significantly, but I do not see myself using them again. Thank God. Story 20. At my office job, I had to do weekly grocery runs for the office kitchen, but this quickly turned into becoming my boss's personal shopper for whatever she wanted to take home. She would throw a fit if I did not buy the expensive versions of items because she assumed they were automatically better, yet I had to stay within our department's budget. So I got creative. I reused the organic egg containers and put regular eggs in them or bought prepackaged cashews and said I got them fresh. All apples are organic apples if you take their stickers off. Story 21. I can expertly install any kind of screen protector perfectly square with no bubbles, using only a piece of tape. Story 22. Throwing a beer barrel onto my shoulder and racking it without help. Knowing all the buttons on the cash register. The other skills I still use when I pour drinks at home or need to clean up quickly. Story 23. Printing paper price tags. Memorizing sales codes for fruits. Driving a forklift with an unstable load. Story 24. I became very skilled at phlebotomy when I worked as a laboratory technician. I could successfully draw blood from most people on the first attempt with minimal pain. I was especially proud when I could draw blood from babies without them crying or noticing the needle. Story 25. To operate anti-aircraft weapons, not needed at the emergency room. Story 26. I once had to learn to use a telex machine. Then, as soon as I learned, they stopped using them. Thank goodness for facsimile machines. May they last forever. Story 27. Answering crisis calls during the night shift. I moved away from the nonprofit sector. Story 28. Perfecting my on-hold small talk voice. I could chat about the weather as if it were breaking news. Story 29. Oh me. I want a poor quality artificial intelligence generated answer from the original poster too. Story 30. I can properly unload and load a dishwasher in under 2 minutes. It is messy and loud, but I am efficient. Story 31. Air Traffic Control Tower. Army. I think I was good at it but never pursued it afterward. Story 32. As a cinema manager, I was trained as a projectionist. It is all digital now. Story 33. I trained abused horses for 20 years until I broke my neck playing soccer. After 3 spinal surgeries and being diagnosed with degenerative disc disease at 28, my back was like that of a 70-year-old. The years I spent learning and studying my whole life felt lost. You can't ride when your pelvis is fused to the bottom few vertebrae. In 5 years, my entire life with horses was ripped from me. Yes, I could still do groundwork, but it is too dangerous if they charge and hit me. Story 34. How to use a Gestetner and other archaic copying machines. How to type a stencil or a carbon copy. In fact, all the various ways of making a copy of a document in an office. Modern photocopiers could not come soon enough. How to use a wage calculating machine. It was not an electronic calculator. You set the numbers and then turned a handle, sometimes forward, sometimes back, sometimes both, if I recall correctly, in order to calculate a person's overtime payments. Both of these were from the early 1970s. Sometimes modern technology has a great deal going for it. Story 35. Architectural lettering and drawing are primarily done on computers nowadays, based on what I have read. Story 36. I am 40 years old. The first company I worked for from 2005 to 2012 was still using a fax machine when I started to get vendor quotes. We bought concrete for our projects in some off-the-grid areas, and it is amazing to think how many people still did not rely on email in the 2010 plus or minus timeframe. Story 37. How to rebuild a vacuum tube cavity in an analog very high-frequency transmitter. Story 38. Being able to eyeball ingredients to make a perfect Whopper, or as it was called, a golden Whopper. I was challenged during a slow shift to weigh out lettuce by sight only, grabbing the right amount on the first try. I succeeded about 10 times in a row with the perfect measurement. Story 39. My resume is filled with the names of obsolete JavaScript frameworks. Oh, Scriptaculous, we hardly knew you. Story 40. I used to work somewhere that had a lot of a specific model of label printer by Intermec. They had been obsolete for years, but there they still were. One of information technology's jobs was fixing them when they went wrong. I could probably still field strip one now. Story 41. Useless in general or useless for my job. I used to do security contracting and penetration testing and learned a number of skills that do not exactly translate outside of those fields. Story 42. Diagnosing and fixing the chemistry and equipment of swimming pools. I am always skeptical and check the maintenance whenever I go swimming at a new place. Story 43. Not having to memorize everyone's extension number and knowing the exact digits to reach Tyler in collections faster than dialing 0 for the directory. Now, it is just one tap in Microsoft Teams. Story 44. I am a software developer. I have mastered many technologies, programming languages, database engines, and frameworks. Most of them eventually become obsolete and are unlikely to be used again. Story 45. How to safely handle concentrated acetylcholinesterase inhibitors without harming myself or others in the laboratory. Story 46. Sending faxes and fixing the fax machine when it inevitably jammed. Story 47. Dealing with difficult coworkers costs the company more than their paycheck. Story 48. Sorting printouts by username at a college computer laboratory. Story 49. Loading large circuit boards into a huge plating line involved many tasks. One in particular was how the boards, which were rather large, were laid on a loader many at a time. The loader lifted the panels into metal clips on a rack for dipping in various solutions during the plating process. The loader did not always seat the panels into the clips fully. We had a tool like a plastic stick, which we would tap on the bottom of the board to push the panels fully into the clips. I always had that stick in my hand, began flipping it, and got really good at multiple flips and catching it. If the boards were not fully in the clips, they could fall off the rack into the solution, which would have to be fished out. This could jam the line, and some of the boards were tens of thousands of dollars each. The solutions were caustic acids. One was called Rack Stripper, which removed metal plating from the rack. It was crazy to see metal disintegrate with orange smoke. I got one drop of that acid on my arm once, and that was bad news. I used the emergency wash sink. My skin fell off when I wiped it. It was intense. Story 50. The skills I developed include designing and evaluating tungsten filament light bulbs. Talk about obsolete technology. Story 51. Writing letters neatly and consistently in the grid so that the key punch operators could input them accurately. Story 52. I was a cashier in a grocery store. 4011, 4035, 4053, 4355, etc. Story 53. I was heavily involved in large business phone systems 25 years ago. I could wire all kinds of circuits from T1 lines to custom RS-232 pinouts. I knew several different standards for terminating RJ plugs for a variety of applications. Now all of that has largely been replaced by Ethernet. Story 54. Writing specific types of SQL statements using long part numbers was tedious when I worked there. I had them install Visual Studio on my machine so I could create a small application that streamlined the process. Since I am no longer in technology, my SQL skills are now unused. However, I still code in C for Arduino projects I create. Story 55. How to run a virtual reality arcade. I worked at two that were in my area. One closed as soon as coronavirus disease 2019 hit, and the other closed a couple of years ago. Story 56. Becoming awake and alert when called at 2 a.m. for a production issue that I would have to explain and defend at 8 a.m. the next morning to a room full of people. Story 57. Chopping 20 cucumbers in 2 minutes is a nice skill to have overall, but it is not as useful after I transferred to a customer service job in the medical field, at least not for now. Story 58. So, I worked for a casual game studio. We made Facebook and iPad games about 15 years ago. The games were made in Adobe Flash Builder. The artists created the art in Photoshop and Maya and exported them as PNG files. My job was to import the art into Flash, set it up correctly, and label it properly so the code could read it and everything would work in the game. I became an expert at Adobe Flash. Animations, mini-games, hidden object scenes, masks, buttons, user interfaces, loading screens, you name it, I did it. I could debug a Flash file faster than you could blink. I would call Adobe and complain when updates caused problems. Flash was such a useful skill to have. Story 59, Coding. Nowadays, it is like, why bother when artificial intelligence writes it faster, cleaner, and better? Story 60. Being able to power through a full 12-hour shift fueled by coffee, beer, and a lot of determination. Story 61. How to professionally use a 4x5 and 8x10 view camera. Also printed black and white and color in the darkroom. Miss those days. Story 62. The touchscreens registered inputs about 1/4 inch higher than you would expect. They were pressure sensitive, not capacitive, so you had to learn to slightly overshoot everything you actually wanted to click on. Story 63. Not entirely useless, but after years of working as a banquet server, I am really good at balancing absurdly heavy or precarious loads on my shoulder. I used to carry trays with more than 20 dinner plates all night for hours, as well as trays filled with dozens of glassware. Story 64. I could scan 60 items per minute on a register. I came to resent checks in particular because they reduced my scan rate. I also deeply resented people who did not take their bags off the carousel when I rotated it to them because I could very quickly run out of space and that also reduced my scan rate. It is not that I took my job seriously or anything. I was just very bored, and practicing my scanning skill was literally the only thing keeping me from going mad. Story 65. I worked in an industrial print shop. I could usually identify the precise ink color needed, and I could tell the paper type by feel most of the time with reasonable accuracy. I no longer work with paper but still have this skill. Story 66. Pulling ice-cold polvi, which is salted beef brisket for the palangi, from a barrel of brine in the fridge of a butchery. My hands can handle extreme cold, and now I am at university watching people complain about the library heating not being warmer. Story 67. Punch cards, later creating or resetting modem strings. On lazy days, attention %F, and if you pissed me off, attention %F you. Story 68. Remembering dozens of landline extensions, none of which exist anymore. Story 69. Just kidding. It is still the most important one. Story 70. Counting money. I used to be a bank teller at a location that processed cash from most of the fast food chains in the area, so I became accustomed to handling large deposits of small bills quickly. I can still count cash very fast and once had to explain myself to a guy I sold an all-terrain vehicle to when he looked at me strangely. Story 71. Developing and printing black and white film and prints in a darkroom. Story 72. I was a certified nursing assistant for a year at a rehabilitation facility. I had to master and still remember how to completely change a bed with someone still in it. I hope I never have to use this skill again. Story 73. Taping boxes shut very fast impresses people. I can do tricks with the tape gun and flip and label them with one hand. Story 74. Running a high-temperature, short-time pasteurizer. No longer used in the cheese industry. Story 75. I used to literally cut and paste. I had area codes and country codes memorized. Various green screen computer systems have been retired and replaced with Windows-style systems. Story 76. Dot matrix printing and roller print machines. I forgot the real name of it, but you would turn a handle that rotated a cylinder, and it would then copy the image to a blank page. Blue color was mostly used. I still remember the smell. Well, that shows how old I am. Story 77. Sending a poorly lit photograph of my penis to a girl I liked who lived far away was difficult. It is much easier now with smartphones. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.